Hello friends, in this video I am going to rant and ramble incessantly about the infinite 80s nostalgia glitch. I'm going to explain what that is. I'm going to describe the history up to that point and up till now and everything before and after relating to that. And I'm going to narrow down what I mean by the 80s nostalgia glitch. If you have any friends that love the 80s or have any friends that hate the 80s, please share this video with them. I think everybody will get a kick out of it if you have an opinion either way. And this one is a pretty important subject to me. I've been working on this script for a long time. I'm going to try to do a really smooth sailing job on it. And please subscribe and share the video around. Give me some comments down below, and let's get started. All right, first story is I live right across the street from a middle school, 7th and 8th grade, and sometime last year I was outside doing some gardening and stuff, and I heard one of the cars when they were picking up the kids, somebody was blasting "You Give Love a Bad Name" by Bon Jovi out of their window, and I just kind of had to smile a little bit because that song came out when I was in middle school, for one thing. And for another thing, that's not something that would have happened 15, 20 years ago. 15 years ago was 2010. Jesus Christ. All right, I'll try to tell this story without succumbing to my existential dread and my own mortality, I guess. But that nostalgia for that, if you're 13 when you're in middle school, 13 or 14, that means their parents had to be in their earliest in 25, 30, and probably in the range. So they wouldn't even have barely been born when that song came out. So that is totally a nostalgia thing for whoever was jamming that song. And it kind of blows my mind because nostalgia always skips generations, because the nature of nostalgia is it's harkening back to a time that you don't remember. So you always sort of romanticize it. Since I was born in the 70s, I always thought of the 60s as kind of a untouchable time that meant something different. And like, my dad lived through it. He was in his teens in the 60s. So he thinks of the 40s probably in the same way that I think of the 60s. So that right there is it's a cultural shift that's just, it just blows my mind to think about. But I could wax philosophical about that kind of thing all day long. Go watch, look through my videos and find one called 20 Years. I feel like I kind of summed up all my feelings about that kind of stuff in that video. But the history, you go back before the 80s, in the 70s, when I was a kid, I'd watch TV and there was syndicated versions of I Love the Lucy from the 50s, but there was also new shows like Happy Days that was set in the 50s, and that always kind of confused me when I was a kid. There was a band that I didn't actually find out until years later were old enough to have played at Woodstock in 1969, but I remember them from a TV show in the 70s. Sha Na Na was a 50s style band, and it just, that the cultural shock, which it was very confusing to me as a kid until I got a little older and started figuring out how to like place those things in the time periods where they belonged. Um, in the 80s, even though there was a lot of things that were pushing towards like sort of a cyberpunk and computer based stuff like Terminator and Blade Runner and war games and all those things, you also had a lot of people culturally looking back to the 60s, like I said, kind of romanticizing the time before we were around and kind of putting people like the Beatles and hippie culture in general sort of on a new pedestal. In the 90s, everything went to the 70s. You had bands like Pearl Jam embracing Hendrix and Neil Young, and Zeppelin was a huge thing, and Dazed and Confused, the movie, is about the 70s and them going to get Aerosmith tickets. And you had the 70s show debuted at the end of the 90s, and the next decade that came along in the 2000s, it should have been the 80s turn, and somehow it just never manifested that way. Speaking of that 70s show, on the success of that show, they tried to do an 80s show, that 80s show, and it failed spectacularly. It made like 13 episodes. It only lasted one season, and nobody cared. You also had people like Rod Stewart, who technically came from the 60s, huge rock star in the 70s, embraced disco and became a huge star in the 70s, but he was still a humongous star in the 80s. He was doing his Great American Songbook. He was kind of cosplaying as Sinatra or somebody like that. You had other 70s and 80s superstars, Phil Collins and Elton John, doing Disney songs. In the 2000s, nobody cared about Motley Crue or Poison or Warrant or Bon Jovi. Even a couple of my favorites of all time, David Bowie and Prince, were barely relevant in the 2000s. The major genres in that time were sort of a spectrum. You had your indie pop, punk, and emo type of stuff, your Scene Kids and all of that thing. And then you had your more acoustic, like Mumford and Sons type of stuff. You had your pseudo garage band things like the Strokes or the White Stripes or the Black Keys. And pop was more hip hop, and hip hop was embracing a lot of disco elements. And to be fair, there were a lot of influences peeking in from the 80s. The Killers could have been an 80s band. I would have put them right next to U2 or somebody like that. Interpol kind of had Cure or something like that. They're kind of a darker 80s Jam or somebody. Franz Ferdinand could have been the Talking Heads, which was technically a 70s band, but they were at their peak in the 80s. Coldplay could have been, basically is the new U2. I know that's going to rub people the wrong way. That's kind of a polarizing statement, but I stand by it. But then what would have been next after that? Even though the 80s didn't really transpire as a nostalgic thing in the 2000s, what would have been next would have been the 90s. And that never happened. The 90s nostalgia was kind of usurped by the 80s thing just a little bit too late. The new wave and glam and hard rock stuff is being featured as influences in a lot of bands from the last 15 years or so, a lot more readily, a lot more worn on their sleeves, those kind of influences. There are some bands that are just now starting to hit on grunge, but not near to the influence of it being a whole nostalgic move. And before anybody attacks me about it, there's always been metal, and there's always been country too. But I don't really know a lot about country, and I don't like to talk about it. So, but metal, you could always see a lineage all the way through from like early Black Sabbath and even Led Zeppelin into Van Halen, and then from Van Halen into Skid Row and all of that. But at some point after the 80s, it kind of just diverged into its own thing. I can see a direct lineage from Led Zeppelin to Skid Row, even though there's a lot of evolution in there. But I don't know how we go from that to like Bring Me the Horizon or whoever. Just kind of, I don't know. I don't know if it's just me, but it kind of lost me in there somewhere. But that's a whole nother side thing. The two reasons why I feel like 90s never had their day in the nostalgia sun, I guess you could say, is one, because a lot of that music is so good, but so much of it is such a downer. I mean, you can't put on half of Alice in Chains or Nirvana stuff and have a big party like you can with 80s music. 80s is just the perfect party music, no matter what kind of genre. If you love the Beatles, 80s stuff is going to fit right in with you. If you love punk rock, 80s stuff, you can still get on board with it because there's an influence in that and a lineage through new wave that leads back to punk rock. But grunge is just so ugh. It's that word, grunge. And like I said, I love grunge bands, so don't attack me for not appreciating. Soundgarden is one of my favorite bands of all time. Alice in Chains, I saw a couple of times back in the day, and I listened to my fair share of that stuff. But it just doesn't lend itself to nostalgia very good. And the other reason why it doesn't lend itself to nostalgia very good is because, like I said before, 90s is 70s. And so many people that are going to hear Nirvana records or Pearl Jam records now weren't even born when this stuff was out. People our age can place nostalgia on it because they were there. But like I said before, the nostalgia of hearkening back to a time from before you were around, I feel like there's not going to be a lot of people that are going to be able to listen to Pearl Jam and then listen to Neil Young back to back and be able to tell where it came from. All right, so all that being said, let's get back into the 80s. The Weeknd's career is 10 years old now. And there's a YouTube channel that I like to watch with a couple of really good musicians, Jack Conte and, oh my God, forgive me, I can't remember the other guy's name, but he's amazing. He has a band that does cover songs on YouTube called Stories, and they break down a lot of songs and show you the parts, and sometimes it gets real music theory, and sometimes it's they're just describing the vibes and yada yada yada. But they were doing the weekend, and one of the comments of Blinding Lights when they did that song, he said that the sounds and the vibe of that song is somehow more 80s sounding than a lot of stuff that came from the 80s. And I just thought that was perfect. I just love the way they phrased that. But nowadays we have a lot of genres that are more 80s than actual 80s. Vaporwave and synthwave are both two genres that really throw back to a lot of 80s aesthetics. Hyperpop is another one that doesn't really sound like a lot of 80s stuff, but it sounds like 80s that's been glitched out so super hard. But I can find a direct link all the way back. You can go Charlie XCX, and that is an evolution of Katy Perry. And Katy Perry was an evolution of Britney Spears. And Britney Spears was an evolution of Madonna, who is still around. Out of all of those artists, she's the one. Madonna is more relevant than Britney Spears or Katy Perry now. And that's just another testament to the 80s glitch, the 80s nostalgia glitch. Somebody like Kylie Minogue, who I adore, she is still just as beautiful and just as entertaining as she was in 1991. And I think her first hit was The Locomotion, and that was in the 80s. So she goes on the 80s bus, and I love it. New Wave kind of became the 80s thing. It was kind of the collision of disco and punk rock. And that's a whole rabbit hole I could make a whole video about. But a lot of those punk bands started getting synthesizers, and a lot of the disco bands started getting guitars, and a lot of them just decided that they all wanted to get hits. And so it kind of just became this whole new wave movement that, like I said, you can still hear in all kinds of music nowadays. And who knows what makes things hit just right. You think of the boy bands, the 80s kind of kicked off what we think of as boy bands. You can argue that there's been boy bands forever, that the Osmonds were kind of a boy band, and all of the singing groups from the 60s and stuff. But the actual, what we think of now as boy bands, kind of started in the 80s with Menudo and New Edition. And then by the end of the decade, you had the New Kids on the Block. And after they got older and faded out, it took a while for a generation to pass. And then they kind of repackaged it all with the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC and the whole other, the second wave of boy band stuff. And since that time, New Kids have been trying to make a comeback. And just in the last year or two, just in this, what they've been calling recession pop stuff. I've got a whole video I'm going to make about recession pop. But they're finally starting to hit off. They toured together, Backstreet Boys and New Kids. I think it was Backstreet Boys and New Kids toured together. And they're almost as big as they were. I won't say they're as big as they were back in the day, but they're at least as big as they were at the trail off of their career before. The 80s glitch also includes all of the other things in pop culture that were in the zeitgeist. movies and the clothes and hair. Who doesn't remember the teased up hair? I used to go through bottles and bottles of that Aquanet hairspray. Video games graphics of the 80s are laughable by today's standards, but with all of the stuff you can get on a computer game now, I know a lot of people that still have a file that is all of the Nintendo games. And it's funny that a whole catalog of Nintendo games fits on a file size smaller than a regular computer game even did 10 years ago. But if you grew up playing Mario or Pac-Man or Frogger or Centipede, there's nothing like hitting that on the computer. TV, there's TV shows. I bet you there's TV theme songs that even if they didn't have words, you could play for almost anybody over 40 and they would be able to tell you what that theme song was, from Who's the Boss to Family Ties to Facts of Life. What was the one with Growing Pains? Oh, that was such a good one. So many good songs that were just theme songs to TV shows. It's so crazy. No TV shows do that anymore because they just got to get everybody's attention span is like this long. And so they just got to get you right into they do the cold opens. TV shows barely ever did cold opens back then. You watched the opening and then it got into the show with the credits. You watch the credits. Now they put the credits over that's a whole other thing, that attention span thing. It's really changed the way people edit any kind of media, music. Get to the chorus. Don't bore us, get to the chorus. You don't have intros anymore because you got 30 seconds to get to the chorus, or else people are going to change the track. You got to get right into the show. We'll put the credits over. There'll be credits all the way up to the first commercial break because you can't spend 2 minutes of your show with just an opening theme song and the credits. That's just craziness. Cartoons in the 80s were just, as good as cartoons technically have gotten. There was nothing like G.I. Joe and all of that. Oh my God, I can't even get into it. Nothing goes together better than Pac-Man and Parachute Pants and Teased Up Hair and Bangle Bracelets and Cyndi Lauper and I just love it all. And I think that's a lot of my bias is coming through because I was a teenager through all that time. But the next section, I'm going to attempt to explain why that is the 80s, is the perfect, I keep hitting the tripod there, is the perfect connection of all of this nostalgia stuff. Music production was just perfect. The technology had gotten just good enough that they had a lot of tricks. You started getting synthesizers a lot more and drum tracks or drum machines, but it hadn't fully taken over yet. There was some people that were pushing the envelope on that stuff between Thomas Dolby and Trevor Horn, and I've talked about it in several videos, especially the 1984 videos. Trevor Horn, Thomas Dolby, who is the other one? Flock of Seagulls. That guy did a lot of technical keyboard stuff. Howard Jones. All of those people were really pushing the envelope on the synthesizers and electronic music, but it was seeping into mainstream music, but it hadn't fully taken over. I think of it like the way I think of movies, where there was nothing like uh, Die Hard, when Bruce Willis jumps off the building and crashes in, and the explosions, and Rambo and Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger both doing shoot 'em ups and big blow 'em ups. And you knew all that stuff was real. They may have enhanced it with a lot of effects, but for the most part, all of those stunts were real. If you crashed a helicopter into a train, they really had to crash a helicopter into a train. And they may have used miniatures for a lot of explosions and stuff, but they were still blowing something up. It wasn't just complete CGI. And the same thing I was saying about the synths. It's cool that they've made a lot of movies like Sky Captain and The World of Tomorrow and the Star Wars movies and stuff where they're really pushing the envelope on what they can do with CGI. But when I see stunts in movies anymore, it's just lackluster, because I'm like, they could have just CGI'd that. I mean, they probably did. And it just doesn't have the excitement that the real thing had when, somebody would jump off of a moving train. Like, they really did that stunt. That's no CGI, because there was no CGI back then, in the beginnings of CGI. But you know what I'm saying? I mean, it's just different. There was no CGI and there was no auto-tune. So when you hear something on a record from back then, they really sang that. They really played that. The best songs are when there's live musicians in the room playing it. I saw a video recently of the guy that played the keyboard part for Michael Jackson's Beat It, or Billie Jean. 8 notes. Nowadays, they would have just plopped those 8 notes in the DAW and just ran it to the end of the song, just looped it out. But that guy said, I played that whole song, that one little loop that never changes, played it for the whole song. And you know what? You can feel that. You may not think you can, but you can feel that. Everything nowadays is usually just one person in a room. They snap everything to the grid. They auto-tune the shit out of everything, so everything's perfectly in time, perfectly in tune, and it has no magic. And I don't want to sound like old man yelling at clouds. And Rick Beato is kind of right about a lot of that stuff. It's true. We've lost the humanity, and that's the whole point of art. And I know we're getting to the point where AI is going to start doing a lot more of that stuff, but it's not art anymore. And like I said, I'm de-evolving into a whole nother conversation there. But let's try to get back to the 80s stuff. Auto-tune. Nothing beats pounding out the parts to a song in the room with somebody, even if it's just one other person that's going to play the guitar track, and you're going to try to make it as in tune and in time as you can, but just somebody still playing it. There's a story about Nile Rodgers, who's one of the greatest producers and probably rhythm guitar players of all time, and they said he could literally make the click track on a song disappear, because he would just play so in time with the tune that the click track would disappear. And at the same time, he could still push it forward. And like, look at something like Get Lucky. That's like the most 80s song that's come out besides The Weeknd, in the last 20 years. And it's because it's got those electronic elements, but it also has a human thing to it. Pharrell's singing, and Nile Rodgers is playing the guitar on that, and it just makes it sound human. Oh, 80s songs are continually resurfacing either as interpolation and a lot of stuff. There's a lot of music now where people are starting to get pretty shameless of lifting hooks and melodies and sometimes even the words to a chorus right out of a song. And a lot of that stuff is coming from the 80s. And then you have stuff like Stranger Things that made songs like Running Up That Hill and Master of Puppets successful again 40 years after they were big originally. And what that does in a way is it compounds the nostalgia. So kids that are growing up now that hear that interpolation or see Stranger Things and hear Running Up That Hill, when they're older, they're going to remember their youth because of that song. But really, they're remembering the 80s. They're leapfrogging generations. Kind of the same way as, like I was saying about the 90s and the 70s thing. You got 30 to 45 years to work with that nostalgia. And every genre is involved in that because you have bands now. I've been hearing a lot of new music, and you have bands now that trying to sound like old school Metallica. They sound exactly like there's one band I found that wears the makeup and the teased hair, and their name, they even use the umlauts just like Motley Crue, and they sound just like Motley Crue. And they're you're not going to get away from the 80s thing. And here's my challenge for you, is I can take anything you like from now or the past 10 or 15 years, and I could find you something from the 80s that is very similar. I won't say just like it, but very similar and is just as good. So, my last point that I wanted to make, and it could probably be its own video, but I don't really care about it enough, so I'm just going to tag it on here. Since we're talking about nostalgia, I saw a couple of articles that were talking about Gen Z is already pushing their 90s, early 2000s nostalgia. And to be fair, it has been 20 years. A lot of those 15-year-olds are 35 now, and they're right at the ripe age to where you start hitting the nostalgia. But I'm just not sure how much people are going to have nostalgia for the scene kids and the hipsters from the early 2000s. And a lot of the bands that they're going to have nostalgia for are basically still around. You have your Bring Me the Horizon and the Killers and the Strokes. I don't know if the Strokes are still around, but technically they are. Jack White and is not in the White Stripes anymore, but he's still around, and all of the bands from that time are still around. It's a different era than it used to be, where bands would only last 5 or 8 years. So we'll see how that goes for them. But I can guarantee you we're not done with the 80s yet. Recession pop, which I mentioned earlier, I'm going to make a whole video going into my opinion of that, but it's basically all of the stuff that harkens back to the early or middle 2000s and early 2010s, but it's basically 80s pop is what it is. It's Madonna redone, and bands like Glass Animals, and I mentioned earlier, like I said earlier, The Weeknd, and the grooves are just too good, and the nostalgic sounds and innovative sounds from drum machines. Phil Collins invented the that reverbed snare drum sound. I've heard that on a lot of newer music, and the cheap keyboard sounds that are just kind of novelty. Novelty is the word I was looking for a second ago. They're just too much fun. It's just too much fun, and there's just going to be no more nostalgia anymore, because everything is going to be the 80s forever. So that's the video. I'm not even going to edit. I'm going to leave this raw. But this is one of the most important subjects that I've made a video about so far, and so I really hope you share this with some people, and I'll see you on the next one. Thanks, guys.